Okay, so up to this point we have talked about how cellular respiration happens in the presence of oxygen. So let's do a brief summary of how that happens. You have the first process, which is glycolysis, and the purpose of glycolysis is to break glucose down into a molecule that can be used by the mitochondria. So glucose is broken down into pyruvate or pyruvic acid. That process creates 2 ATP. It also creates NADH, which gets sent over to the electron transport chain, which is here. This is your third process. So this is your ETC here, even though it doesn't say it, electron transport chain. And then you also, once the pyruvate gets broken down or is created during glycolysis, it goes into the citric acid cycle known as the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle also produces 2 ATP, as well as NADH and FADH2, which then get transported to the electron transport chain in order to create a larger amount of ATP, specifically 32. So there's 32 ATP created during the electron transport chain, 2 created during the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and 2 created during glycolysis for a total of 36 ATP. And remember, this is with the presence of oxygen. So what happens if oxygen is not present? Well, first let's talk about conditions that might lead to that. Specifically when you exercise. So when you exercise, you're undergoing elevated rates of cellular respiration in your cells because you need more energy. Okay, your cells cannot store chemical energy in ATP for very long. In fact, it's only a matter of seconds because it's very unstable and is therefore used immediately. Okay, so only the cells that produce the ATP are able to use it. So every single cell has to produce ATP. And therefore, the body uses carbohydrates and fats for storing chemical energy for long periods of time. These are eventually converted back into glucose and then used during cellular respiration. As a result, more cellular respiration occurs during periods of sustained exercise. Okay, that's the important thing from this slide that you need to know. You need to know that as a result of more cellular respiration, as a result of exercise, more cellular respiration needs to occur. And therefore, during periods of things like sprinting, okay, there isn't enough time for cellular respiration to occur, and therefore another energy-producing process involves lactic acid. And we're going to talk about that, which creates a smaller amount of energy than normal cellular respiration. All right? And so these are what we're talking about. We're going to be talking about lactic acid fermentation as an alternative to cellular respiration. Okay, so lactic acid fermentation as an alternative to cellular respiration. And if you want a little fun fact, a working muscle, so if you're like working out in the gym or playing soccer or running, uses over 10 million ATP molecules a second. So think about how many molecules you use on a daily basis if you're constantly working out. That's a ton. So the answer to that question, what do you do if oxygen is not present? Okay, so if you don't have oxygen available, there is an alternative. If you remember, however, when oxygen is available, so this is when O2 is available, okay, glucose is split in half, okay. During your normal process, it uses ATP and to do that, and then creates ATP and NADH, which is then sent to electron transport chain. And in that process, it creates pyruvic acid. Now, that's when that's when oxygen is available and is called aerobic. Okay, how I remember aerobic is that air sounds like air. Okay, which people usually associate with oxygen. So aerobic requires oxygen. The alternative to aerobic is something called anaerobic. All right, and when you put "an" in front of a word, it typically means without. So anaerobic means without oxygen available. So what happens during this is ATP is used to create ADP, and by doing so we split glucose into two 3-carbon molecules. Then ADP is created, or is used to create ATP. All right, and again you get 2 ATP created. Net, okay, because you used 2 here and you created 4, so you get 2 overall created. And then NAD gets converted to NADH. But instead of NADH going to the electron transport chain, as it would if oxygen was present, if oxygen is not present, NADH is instead going to go over here and convert pyruvic acid. So this is your pyruvic acid into another molecule called lactic acid. By doing that, you replenish your NAD plus store, which can then be reused over here, because the electron transport chain is not working, and therefore you can't use NADH if you do not convert pyruvic acid into lactic acid. So what we do here by creating lactic acid is allow us to recycle the NAD plus, so then we can break down more glucose without oxygen being present. So it's all about whether or not oxygen is present, whether or not you're producing this lactic acid. So what ends up happening is lactic acid burns your muscles. All right, if you've ever been sprinting, okay, and you've just been sprinting like 100 or 200 yards, your muscles are going to burn. Like they actually have a burning sensation. That comes from lactic acid that is being stored in the muscle. Pyruvic acid is broken down, all right, is therefore not stored, so it doesn't affect your muscles. Whereas lactic acid is not broken down, and it stays in the muscles and creates a burning sensation. So this is the lactic acid fermentation as an example of aerobic respiration. We'll take a look at this in class, okay, so don't worry about this just yet. But if we take a look to basically break down lactic acid fermentation versus regular cellular respiration, in regular cellular respiration, the ETC and the Krebs cycle, along with glycolysis, create a total of 2, 4, and 32 equals 36. So this is when O2 is present. Okay, 36 ATP. On the other hand, so you have 36 during aerobic. On the other hand, lactic acid does not do the Krebs cycle. It only goes through glycolysis. And therefore, it only creates 2 ATP. Okay? For this reason, when people, for this reason, okay, when you undergo glycolysis, you can only create 2 ATP, and it's only a temporary thing. So when you undergo anaerobic glycolysis, this can only happen for a short period of time because eventually you will run out of ATP. So you'll need to replenish your oxygen store so that you can undergo aerobic respiration in order to create your 36 ATP. So this is a very interesting process because this does allow us to sustain for a short period of time, but it is only a temporary process that will eventually need to go back to aerobic respiration in order to survive. And there are two types of anaerobic respiration. There's lactic acid, which we just talked about, and then there's a type that occurs in yeast. Okay, it's called alcoholic fermentation, and this is where glucose creates ATP and CO2 as well as a form of alcohol. And this is how a lot of your alcohols are made, like beer or wine, and even bread. The yeast that makes your bread undergoes alcoholic fermentation as well.